Welcome to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno. Today's guest is retired football analyst Bobby McMahon. He appeared on Fox Soccer Report and Fox Soccer News between 2001 and 2013. Bobby, it's a great pleasure to have you on the show today. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
There has just been an absolute whirlwind of news in the Premier League in the last month, particularly with one of the most out-of-the-blue signings that people did not foresee in Cristiano Ronaldo making his return to the Theatre of Dreams, rejoining Manchester United after a decade hiatus, having played in the La Liga with Real Madrid and having played in the Serie A with Juventus. How crazy is it that Ronaldo is playing on Man U, and what was it that really created this opportunity in the first place? Because most people were saying he was going to sign with City. People were rumoring he was going to sign with PSG, but United is where he's landed. So give me your thoughts on Ronaldo's move back to the Premier League.
I think that the Ronaldo Manchester United one has been a basic kind of theme on Twitter and other parts of social media for some time. But I've always got the impression with the Manchester United fans who threw that out, they didn't actually believe it was going to happen. It was almost like kids wishing for someone at Christmas, knowing it wasn't going to appear, but it didn't stop them wishing for it. And I think everybody's absolutely shocked and stunned when it actually did happen. But the kind of two key pieces to it is, one, Juventus finding themselves in such dire straits financially and realising that a 36 or 37-year-old Ronaldo with his salary package wasn't going to help them dig out of a very deep hole that they were in. You've got to consider that, you know, the basic premise of taking Ronaldo to Juventus was a business one, but fundamentally it was all about winning the Champions League. Juventus had got there they'd been there close a number of times. They hadn't done it. They felt Ronaldo could put them over the top. It didn't work. So once that doesn't work, can you afford that kind of money that he was getting paid just to win Serie A every year? And then last year, they didn't even win Serie A. So it was a case of unloading that. And then the real key to this is not so much Manchester United signing Ronaldo, it was the fact that Manchester City were believed to be in the running to sign Ronaldo. And that is just something that, from a business point of view and a marketing point of view, that Manchester United could not tolerate having Ronaldo. It's one thing with Carlos Tevez going across the road, but it's completely different when you're talking about Cristiano Ronaldo. It's very difficult to come up with a comparison to that, or something that would be equal to it. But you know, when that happened, then United have no option really but to jump in, because no matter the outcome, Manchester United fans would have been absolutely livid, and it would have been a major red face for the organisation. And so obviously, it became something that they really are forced to do. But it's got an upside for it as well, because he's going to continue to score goals. Now, I'm quite convinced in the short term it's going to be a very, very good signing. Whether it's a long-term benefit, well, we'll have to wait and see. But certainly from a short term, even from a neutral fan point of view, it's great to have him back in the Premier League if you're a fan of the Premier League. And so it just adds an awful lot of extra spice to that league already. And given that he's so driven, you can see him being productive for at least another 2 years.
It makes me think of another major signing that happened. I think it was in the late 90s, early 2000s, when Luis Figo went from Barcelona to Real Madrid, and that just sent Barca fans on fire. They were livid. They were super angry. I think also, if I'm not mistaken, the Brazilian Ronaldo had played with Inter, then Barcelona. I think he also played for Real Madrid afterwards, if I'm not mistaken. And it causes those rivalries. You make a great point.
Yeah, but even then, it was nothing quite the same, because you're not talking about being in the same city. And there's a very different context to the rise of Manchester City. Like Barcelona and Real Madrid's rivalry goes back decades and decades and decades. And although City and Manchester City and Manchester United are the same city, there's been very few points up until the last few years where they could be really considered real rivals. You'd have to go back to 67, 68, 69 the great Manchester, particularly the great Manchester City team of that year, and especially in '68 when Manchester City just put Manchester United in the last day of the season to win the league. But, so the Figo going Barcelona, Real Madrid, yeah, it gets the fans upset as much about the way it was done as much as anything else. And then even Ronaldo, the original Ronaldo, to some extent, Barcelona wanted to sell him. And so he went to Inter. And then when he went to Real Madrid, he'd been injured so much at Inter. I don't think many people really thought he had much left in him at that point. So it wouldn't have been such a slap in the face as Cristiano Ronaldo. And I'm sure, let's face it, when we get right down to it, Cristiano Ronaldo and his agents and his backroom team must have leveraged the hell out of the deal as well, knowing that Manchester City were interested.
100%. The age of social media has made these things seem far more amplified than they would have been 20, 30, 40 years ago, when football seemed to have way more loyalty back then. But when you look now with how much money is involved compared to way back when, it almost seems more commonplace to see people play for crosstown rivals or rivals within the same league, whereas back in the day, you'd be sworn by the blood of the club you played for and you would never leave. And you see that a lot in Italian players. You look at Maldini or the Baressis of the world or Totti never left their club through thick and thin, or Del Piero never left his club, not even during Calciopoli, nothing. But now I remember Bayern started to do it when all the players were funneled from the rest of the Bundesliga over to Bayern. When Neuer left, I think in the late 2000s, I was like, okay, that's it. If Neuer left Schalke, then anyone can leave anybody in the Bundesliga. There's all bets are off. You know what I mean?
Having said that, I've got just off to my right here, I've got my my little library, and I've got books going back to when I was a kid in the 60s. And I could pull some of these 60s books off the shelf, and I can guarantee you I can find an article where people are complaining about there's no loyalty left in the game, and it's all about money. Like, the thing, it just gets bigger. The money gets bigger, the social media, the involvement, everything just gets bigger. But the same precepts, the context is still pretty much the same. You go back to the stuff that I lived through when I was a kid. There was one-way traffic between Scotland and England. A player, Sir Alex Ferguson is a good example of it. Either went to Rangers or Celtic, or they went south. Ferguson played for Queen's Park. He went I remember seeing him play for St Johnstone in the early 60s. He then went to Dunfermline. He scored a hat-trick for St Johnstone against Rangers. Rangers remember him. He scored a ton of goals one year with Dunfermline. Next year, finishes up at Rangers, right? And there's just, they talk about the great Celtic team of '67 and how they were all born from only about 30 miles from Glasgow. But you go through them, and there's a lot of these players signed who had left for other clubs. Ronnie Simpson came from Hibs. Willie Wallace came from Hearts. Bertie Auld was Celtic, went to Birmingham, came back to Celtic. So you've got a number of these examples where people left and came back, and so that kind of one-way traffic to the Old Firm or down at England was very dominant as soon as players, because they could just make more money down there. They can generally make more money in the Old Firm as well, certainly improve their status and improve their international chances. But otherwise, it was going down to England. And you go back through the 50s to 60s, even before the 50s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even to some extent into the 80s. You see the number of Scottish players that would just head south to the border for big money, because that's the only way they could make a decent living at that time. Now, very much changed now, because it's gone very much beyond a decent living. And some would describe it as an indecent living in terms of how much money some of the players make.
Well, I must ask you, as someone of Scottish descent, that there's obviously the huge rivalry with England, and that, like you mentioned, there is that one-way street crossing the border. You don't want to dare see someone come back once they leave. But Scotland have always seemed to be in a bit of a rut in terms of their competitiveness on the international levels compared to England, whereas their individual players have been amazing, and a lot of them have played in clubs all across the world. What are some of the issues that you've seen with Scotland on the international level as compared to England as to why they haven't ascended like England have over the years? I mean, even though England obviously haven't won a World Cup, but they've come closer than Scotland have.
Yeah, well, you're talking about a population base of 10 times as much. So you're looking at 5 million to 50 million. So there's obviously more, there's more people there, more people, bigger market means more money, etc., etc. But every country to some extent, even the very best countries do generally go through peaks and valleys, except, you look at Scotland, whose valley has lasted for quite a long time. But there's a number. I mean, we could probably spend an entire podcast talking about that dynamic, because you got things like the collapse of the Soviet Union, which spawned so many more countries entering UEFA, which then made it just by its nature more difficult to qualify, because there was good individual countries coming out there. There was no Ukraine before the 90s. There was, you've got Georgia, you've got Azerbaijan. Now, some of these countries are not going to be considered world-class countries by any chance and are threats to win a World Cup. But the fact is just more games to play, more opportunities for upsets, etc., etc. But to me, the biggest flaw over the last number of years in Scotland was there was a period in Scottish football when the owners and the people that ran these clubs almost seemed to take on a feeling that if importing players was a model that worked in the Premier League, so we'll do the same. We won't import the same calibre of players because we can't afford it, but we'll go and start signing players from overseas. And some of these players from overseas that were bought were just, in many cases, weren't very good and weren't worth the value, but they also stopped young players graduating in the traditional way through being signed as youth players into reserve teams, into full teams, and there was a flow to it. And so you look at the individual players, you look at the Scottish team now. I think Kieran Tierney is a fantastic player. Andy Robertson is a good player, and there's a couple of other really good players. You compare that to the team in the 60s, and the team in the 60s never got to a World Cup final, never got to the World Cup finals, full stop. But you look at 1962, they got knocked out in a replay by Czech Republic. At that time, it was Czechoslovakia, of course. Czechoslovakia went on to play in the World Cup final and lost to Brazil. In 66, they lost out to Italy in qualifying, went down in the last game. That happened. And then in preparation for 1970, they lost to West Germany. So there was a number of periods where it just, these were the days when you used to have 3-team groups and you finished top, and that was the only route, 3 or 4 team groups, and that was the only route to the finals. Then you get into the 70s, and the 70s were really the glory, the late 60s, early 70s. Late 60s were the glory years for Scottish club football. But the glory years for the international team really was the 70s, when they went to the World Cup finals in Germany, West Germany in 74, went to Argentina, even though it was a disaster in 78. And England didn't qualify. There was a period where England really, really struggled. So although England won in 66, got to the quarterfinals in Mexico in 70 before going out in extra time to West Germany, they went to a slump as well. And you look at the individual team, there's a team that includes players like Trevor Brooke and Kevin Keegan. Kevin Beattie, I thought was a great player, but they couldn't get there either. So there's a lot of things goes into these either failures or success. But can Scotland ever get back to where in the 70s? I doubt it very much, because the world is just a different place in terms of the money that can be invested in producing players. And you look at the quality, some of the England players coming through the system in the last 3 or 4 years has been absolutely outstanding. You've got some really incredibly good English talent there. Now, they've still got holes, and the English media still think they're better than they are. And there's still a big cheer every time they get beat eventually. But my God, it's getting closer all the time. Like the Croatia semi-final in Russia in 2018 gave me palpitations. And then extra time against Italy and going to penalty kicks. They're getting close. And the bottom line to it is the quality of players they're producing, that they should be now at the stage where they're going into the World Cup in reality being a favourite, to one of the favourites to pick up the trophy, rather than being one of the favourites in the media's eyes, which has always been something that finishes in tears for them, because the media bump them up and keep on inflating expectations and get carried away, and then they're the first to turn on the English team when they fail. When the reality is, they weren't in that top echelon before they went to the World Cup anyway.
That's a great point, because England have slowly been improving. And growing up as a kid, I remember seeing whenever they flopped to the World Cup, everyone had a party. It was the best day in the world for everybody except for English fans.
Yeah.
And I know in 2006, seeing Portugal beat them on penalties made me so happy.
Yeah.
And in 2010, crashed out in 2014, et cetera, et cetera. But in 2018, it seemed really odd for them to have success. Now, mind you, when they lost to Croatia, then it was like, yeah, they're frauds. We knew it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it didn't seem like 2020 was that much of a fluke. People were saying, well, they got lucky. And I'm like, I don't know, man. Like they beat Germany fair and square, and no one thought that they were going to win that game. And then they had to beat Ukraine. They had to beat Denmark, and they almost beat Italy. To be honest, I think they should have beaten them. And like you said, the media creates these expectations that make it so that everyone loves it when England loses. But to be honest, England are probably way closer than everyone actually thinks because of how much the media inflates them. But they could honestly be in the final again next year in Qatar.
Yeah, you look at that final against Italy, and I think to some extent the early goal possibly was something that actually worked against them rather than worked for them, because once Verratti and Jorginho and Chiellini and Bonucci started playing that little square, England, I think, were outthought at that point, and they didn't know how to react, and they finished up, resorting to type and playing maybe more long balls than they should have. But they're not playing a particularly attractive form of football, but it's succeeding in as much as they generally absorb pressure and look for the opportunities to come along. When you've got kind of goal scorers that they do have, and the goal scorers that are coming along, then I guess it's a case of playing to your strengths, and that's your strength. So play to it. I think they do have a couple of kind of areas that they could still improve on. They still, they look to, I guess, coming off the bench, Jack Grealish to be that kind of creativity. I think his future is very much dependent on how Guardiola molds him at Manchester City. Because I'll be honest, I'm not convinced by Jack Grealish. Before he's moved to Manchester City, I've always considered him more of an impediment than an advantage, because he, to me, slows the game down too much, because he requires that ball at his feet, and he keeps the ball at his feet, and he doesn't know how to use it in a positive way to the greatest extent. He does use it in a positive way once he gets it, but he does give other teams, I think, a lot of time to get back behind the ball and defend in depth. So anyway, you go through these players, and absolutely great going into the Qatar now. The conditions, who knows about Qatar? Like, I think it's going to be a bit of a raffle, a bit of a lottery as far as conditions are there. We're not quite sure what to expect. The other thing, I think, and this is unfortunate, but I think the effects of the timing of the Qatar World Cup in November, December, and the extension it's going to cause for 223 season, 222, 223 season beyond, is going to have ramifications for many years to come. And I just don't think that the players are going to be given the rest period that they deserve. And you start looking at, yes, we had COVID in the middle and there was a big gap, but you saw the effect of COVID as well. Games coming very, very quickly. Now, it's helping the teams that got bigger squads, perhaps, in terms of, but it still takes away, I think, from the really top class players, and you just wonder if they're going to get the legs run off them, and we're just going to see more injuries, and perhaps not at the World Cup in 2022, but the years after it, the game being shorn a little bit of top quality because of injuries catching up with players through fatigue.
The international break being in a different time, as it usually is, because of that November-December schedule, is definitely going to be something that people are going to want to watch out for, because, as you said, COVID creating there to be a schedule where people had to catch up on playing games really fast. And again, conditions of playing in Qatar, November, December, it's still going to be quite hot, even if you're playing late at night, and then having to play in the middle of your season, and then having to extend your season, and knowing what ramifications those will have down the road is going to make for maybe some underdog teams to have a better run at the trophy. Maybe not that they're going to win it, but you look at how Denmark rallied. They did very well after the very shocking injury at the very first game against Finland. But I'm interested to know how you think some of the teams who are supposed to be top contenders at the Euro in 2021 this summer will rebound from their disappointment. France and Portugal in particular, the two teams that made the 2016 final in France, were out in the round of 16 at Euro 2020. How do you think they'll rebound in 2022, or will they rebound at all, considering this will be Ronaldo's last major tournament? And Mbappe was absolutely stunned as compared to his brilliant performance in 2018 in Russia.
Well, what you can't factor in is the fatigue of individual players. But I think if you analyze it from going to basics, you look at both these countries and you look at the age makeup of the squad, and you look at perhaps what's coming through the age group squads, and you make a judgment of whether they're still producing good players. Now, to be at that very top and to win a World Cup, it's not a case of having just a couple of good players. You need real quality throughout the team and through the squad and coming off the bench. But if you look at Portugal, you look at France, there's no reason why they can't, in your words, rebound for Qatar in 2022, because both countries are still producing lots of quality talent. There's still very good young players coming through that system. So you think that from a basics point of view, is going to get you there. The question, though, is, and this is where it becomes something we really just don't know, is because of the way the World Cup is structured, where you've got the group competition and then the knockout. You're really any knockout competition, which I've always considered knockout football, knockout soccer, as the lifeblood of the game, because we don't like being on the other end of an upset. But the reality is the upsets that keep us giving faith that maybe our team will be right on the day, or it keeps us coming back to see somebody else get knocked off. So, these things have to blend into it. And there's some, when you get down to it, there's some very, very good teams that have never won a World Cup. But, the Dutch are probably the best example of it through 74 and 78. Certainly the best team in 74 from a tournament point of view. And arguably, certainly in the latter stages in Argentina, the best team in Argentina as well, or certainly one that, certainly could be argued such. And you can go through a number of examples like that where the best team hasn't necessarily won. Sometimes the best team doesn't even get to the final itself. If you go back to England won in '66 and they beat Germany, but arguably Portugal was the best team in the tournament in '66, coming out absolutely no place. So you've got these examples of that time and time again, and so that's the unknown. You need to have the quality, you need to have the depth, you need players to peak at the right time, but you also need a bit of luck as well.
Another team that comes to mind when you talk about best teams that don't make the final, Brazil 1982. First team that comes to mind.
The 82 team, the little bit changed the structure that year, where you again had, just as you did in 70, 78, 74 was a knockout, or 74 was the start of it, I believe, where you went to the second group phase. And then because 70 was knockout, 74, 78, 82 was all that kind of second phase group, which made it extremely difficult. But that was, I remember VCRs were relatively new on the market, and I spent a shitload of money I should probably never spend on VCR, because I was determined that I was going to see the World Cup, and because most of the games were the afternoon or morning. So I'd tape the games and make sure. It was much easier these days to ignore, because there was no such thing as social media. You either got your news through TV, radio, or waited for it in print. So you could actually avoid getting told the score, especially I was in Canada at that time in '82. So you wouldn't have actually known there was a World Cup on in many cases. So I could avoid it, but I'd race home at night, and after taping the games, I'd watch the game. I just could not believe. Like I thought after the group stage, really anoint Brazil world champions in '82, and it just all went wrong. But it's once again, it's an example as well, with a bit of belief, bit of organisation, and in their case with Rossi hitting a really incredible streak of goal scoring for him, that it doesn't happen all the time. But if you believe, sometimes miracles do happen, and that in itself was a little bit of a miracle. Particularly, we got to remember as well, as good as Brazil were, Italy had been absolutely abysmal up to that point. Like, I think it was 3 draws, and 3 draws you wouldn't expect of them. Like, it was just, it was considered to be a bad team. We were getting written off right, left, and centre. 10 days later, they're picking up the World Cup.
Just one of the craziest upsets in tournament history. And that's why when Portugal won Euro 2016, I know so many people were so mad saying this is illegitimate. They didn't even really win a game because they also tied 3 games against probably in the weakest group of the tournament. They tied Iceland, who had never made the Euro. They tied Austria 0-0 and Ronaldo missed a penalty. And they tied Hungary, who has barely made the Euro and hasn't even made the World Cup since 82. So the fact, or 86, I think it was actually 86. So I think it was last time.
Yeah, they were in Canada's section in 86.
Yeah, in 86. So there's a lot but the last time they did well was 82 when they thrashed El Salvador, the famous game. I don't even think they made it out of the group though. In 82, they didn't make it out of the group, did they?
No, no, Hungary never. I don't believe Hungary qualified in 82. I'm trying to remember. It went to, we got 4 groups of 3, I think.
Because they beat El Salvador 10-1. That's like the biggest win in World Cup history. But I don't think they made it out of the group in 82.
I don't think so. I think you're right. I don't remember them getting to the. That was kind of like a dead rubber by that stage.
Yeah, which is insane. And you look at how Italy, like the arc of Italy's success is so weird. 34, 38, top of the world. And then just they floundered for years. And then 82, they come out of nowhere and win and have these expectations. And then in 90, they do well. 94, they lose the final. The first one goes to penalties. 98, they're so close. 02, they should win. And then they finally win in 06. And then they flounder in 2010 and 2014 and 2018. And then Euro 2020, they win the Euro after the first time in 56 years, where they won the replay against Yugoslavia in 68. That I'm not even sure most Italy fans even knew that they had won the Euro only once and that it was in 1968. Yeah. And then they had to replay the game in order for them to win. So that's what makes the game, I think, a little bit crazier now, is like there's no playing over the match one more time. You got to just like win right then and there. And that's what can make anything happen.
And it's a real example. Like, you go through tournament play. It's not, we all like to kind of, when a tournament starts, going, oh, look at them, they're playing really well, I think they're going to win it. But invariably, the other thing you see is you go back and it's very, very rare. It's a very, very rare thing to see a team that starts well going on to win a tournament. Usually a team that starts well, because Spain were infamous for starting tournaments well and then getting knocked out the first group stage or the first knockout stage. So you've got to have that certain, even though it might be 6 games, 7 games, whatever, there's a certain amount of pacing and a certain amount of peaking that you've got to do at the same time. It's very, very rare to have that dominance from start. Brazil probably in 2002 in Korea and Japan were the closest you would kind of get to that. One of the rare times that you actually looked at a team with playing 7 games and winning them all. No flounder at all. There's usually a kind of draw in there, or sometimes even a loss in there. But what it really comes down to, every time you're talking about knockout play, whether you're talking about the Gold Cup in CONCACAF, you're talking about the Euros, you're talking about the World Cup, it's not how you get to the knockout stage. It's just get to the knockout stage, because once you get there, things can happen, especially if you've got some pedigree, I think.
I must ask you, since you've seen football over so many years and so many great players in the World Cup era, especially, that never got to win, who, in your opinion, is the best player to have never won the World Cup?
George Best. Sorry, let me take that back. George Best is the best player never to play at a World Cup. The best player not to win the World Cup, Johan Cruyff.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Cruyff, I was going to say, has to be the best footballer to have never won the World Cup. I mean, you look at the Jules Rimet era, it's kind of tough because the teams are just starting to figure out who are the dominant powers. And, Puskas could be up there as well, I think, but maybe different eras wouldn't make for a fair comparison. But Cruyff, not much arguing there.
74, the World Cup in West Germany. It's very hard to come up with a comparison to it, because I remember watching the 74 World Cup. Obviously, high level interest because Scotland got there, and that would be the first time since 1958 they'd actually got to a World Cup final. But the impact of that Dutch team was absolutely enormous. They came out and they were playing football like we'd never seen before. We'd never seen, you could talk about the Hungarian team of the late 40s, early 50s. You could talk about the Italian team, the 30s. You could talk about the Uruguayan team. But the reality is very few people had seen these teams. They'd seen a little bit of them on black and white footage, but mostly they'd seen them by reading about them in newspapers. So it was all passed on. And the Dutch and Brazil to some extent, even 58, 62, it wasn't quite the same because it was, and then 66, kind of Brazil got kicked out of that tournament. It was not a good tournament for them. It wasn't a good tournament for football. But then the Cruyff team of 74 they weren't playing the football that we recognised. They were playing in a way that was just, there was a ball there and the markings were the same and both teams had 11 players. But I remember particularly the game, I think it was the Argentina game when I think they won 4-0. I think they beat Brazil 2-0 just after that. But the 4-0 game against Argentina is the one that just sticks in my memory. It was awe-inspiring the way they played. And it wasn't just Cruyff. Like, I fell in love with Rudy Kroll. I'd never seen anybody hit a pass like Rudy Kroll. He was a defender. Like, it wasn't, Beckenbauer had just a few years before that had moved into the back four and beginning to kind of reimagine that role as a defender that could actually play a bit. But you had Kroll, Van Hanegem. You just went through them. They were just Nishkins. What a player Nishkins was. He was just a force of nature in the middle of the park. And they just single-handedly forced us to look at it differently. We'd seen Ajax to some extent. Feyenoord had won the European Cup, I think, in 1969, 71. 70, I think it was. They beat Celtic. I think 71, Ajax started their run, and Ajax won it 3 years in a row after that, and Bayern Munich took over. We'd seen it, but we'd not seen it, playing against the best in the world necessarily. This was club football. This was taken up a level. At that time when the World Cup was the best, I think you would argue now that the Champions League is over in terms of a standard of football. The Champions League is greater than the World Cup, but in these days the World Cup was the best. And it was just awe-inspiring. And the effect he had on young fans and young players was absolutely enormous, because suddenly you're watching these players that are not just great technically, but they're smart in the head, and they're all smart in the head, and they're all doing things with switching positions and high press and all the things. What I find really interesting, sorry, I'm going to ramble a bit, but I find now they talk about pressing high and all the rest. We always had pressing high. We just called it something different. And everybody's making it out to be something that's just been discovered. It's been done for a long, long time. It hasn't necessarily been done or coordinated or coached in such an organised way. But the Dutch, and even before that, there was teams to some extent. The whole pressing and pressing high has evolved over many, many decades. And so you go back. I was a defender in these days, playing amateur football in Scotland. And I loved the way the Dutch played the offside trap. So I became king of the offside trap after that. Not particularly positive, but who cares? It was effective.
The Dutch team of the 70s, I think, has to be one of the most underrated in football history, because they went to the final back-to-back years, played total football and revolutionized the game, but had nothing to show for it. People are always like, oh, well, they finished second, or well, Germany won, or Argentina won, or Brazil 1970, look at them. But Brazil 1970 was the culmination of a dynasty Brazil was building from the late 50s, when they finally got their first crack at it in 58. And then 62, they went. And at 66, the injury to Pelé and the team falling apart, and Portugal kind of carrying the torch, so to speak, in place of Brazil, with Eusebio playing one of the most brilliant individual performances by any player on a team that didn't win the World Cup, maybe up there with Cruyff and all them. But then 70, they finally capped it off. And then Brazil were dormant for years. We mentioned the 82 team that should have won. 86, they were close. 90, they floundered. And then 94 was a team that almost didn't even make the World Cup, that maybe some fans don't remember, but they had to beat Uruguay in the last game to avoid the Intercontinental playoff. And they ended up running the table when Romario finally got his chance. But that Dutch team in the 70s was just truly something else. The way you describe it just puts images in my mind that I couldn't even imagine, because it was just, like you said, you read about it in the paper or you read about it somewhere else, but to watch it live that was like a watershed moment, I guess I could say, in football history, being able to actually see it for yourself and not just read about it.
Yeah. It's interesting though, you mentioned, the Brazil team in 1970. The Brazil team in 1970 had a trouble qualifying as well. They struggled, and the team went to Mexico on a little bit of a question whether it was going to hold itself together. And there's a really interesting piece as well, and it's been written up a number of times, but how close the Dutch came to not qualifying in 74 as well. They were drawn in a section with Belgium, and I think I'm right in saying they qualified on goal difference in 74. And it was 2 draws with Belgium. Belgium came, and there was a chance late on in, I think, the second game that Belgium didn't take. But that's how, we're back to this serendipity and needing a bit of luck to actually get to be that successful. But, the 78 team, of course, and getting to and doing what they didn't start particularly strongly. Just, they lost to Scotland, and it came very close to it. It was 3-1, another goal for Scotland. The Dutch were going home, we were going on, and it turned around the other way. But that was without Cruyff as well. And Cruyff refusing to go because of fear for his safety because of the situation. So, yeah, one of the greats, that's for sure.
Now, in terms of coaches, there have been many coaches at the international level and the club level. So I want to make this a 2-part question.
Yeah.
Who do you think is the best international coach of all time, and who do you think the best club coach of all time is?
Oh, geez, I'm not sure I can split them because or split. I think there's a number of coaches you would look to, and this is obviously me looking at it. What Jock Stein did for Celtic in the 60s and part of the 70s stands above everything else. Shankly, got a very warm spot in my heart for Bill Shankly, Matt Busby, like that threesome. Unbelievable, quite phenomenal that three coaches who were raised in communities very close to each other should have such an impact. In England, Brian Clough, I think got to give a nod to Clough. But as far as club football is concerned, and this is somewhat biased, I admit it, it's not because I'm a Manchester United supporter, but Alex Ferguson, over a body of work over the number of years, and even then, it didn't look like it was going the right way. The fact that Ferguson did it in 2 countries, he won a European trophy with Aberdeen, and then did the same in Manchester United and dominated large portions of the 90s and the 2000s with Manchester United, and his ability to retool and transform teams. You see so many managers who produce great teams, but can't produce a great team after a great team, and they stumble and it goes. You're at your peak, and so many teams are on that downward slope and find it so hard to get out of it again. But Ferguson, let's face it, you look at how many years he went with. I don't think he went after he started really getting on the run. I don't think he went more than 2 years without a trophy, even if it was just the English League Cup. So from my perspective, you've got to look at him. You obviously go overseas. And Guardiola's at Manchester City now. He's done phenomenal stuff. Cruyff is obviously incredibly influential, but internationally and club football, if you want to put them together, I think it'd be pretty hard to go past Rinus Michels, who was, even though he didn't have the greatest club success with Ajax, he kind of left before they really they continued that kind of run in the European Cup. But the stuff he did and the role he played in developing Dutch football and then the international teams, I think he was voted the coach of the century in the turn of the 2000s. So probably go for him. I think probably in many cases he didn't invent the stuff that he implemented, but be able to bring a whole bunch of ideas together and become that kind of catalyst for it. I think I'd go for him.
Some of those coaches you mentioned have outstanding records, and even sometimes if they don't have as much silverware to show for as maybe some other coaches, the mind that they brought to their teams and how they were able to continually build success year after year, I think is the hardest thing, because you can always win a Champions League here and there. Something can come up, an amazing run. You look at 2012 Chelsea, that was impossible to repeat. It was amazing. Yep. It was a storybook ending, but it's impossible to repeat in the way that they won 2012. Or you look at 2010 Inter, caught Bayern on their back heels, and then that was it. And then Inter doesn't win the Champions League for another chunk of time. But you look at Ferguson, you mentioned, winning the treble, winning year after year after year. And even when they lost the league in the heartbreaking fashion in 2012, when City won, again, still went back and put up a team that could win the next year and the year after, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, and I'm sure you could probably agree with me on this, the most exciting Champions League final of all time has to be 1999. There's no question. Like, I don't know which ones get crazier than the ending between Manchester United and Bayern Munich.
I tell you a story coming out of that, because I was watching that game, and when Manchester United equalised, my thought immediately went to Bayern are going to get up their end and score the winner. Because I thought to myself, here's the team, and we know, when you play the game or watch the game for a long time, you know how that moment of euphoria can sometimes take the focus away. And I would have, if somebody said Manchester United are going to score again about, 90 seconds later or whatever it was, I would have said, nah, much more likely for Bayern to go up the other end. Because Bayern had dominated that game. They'd hit the frame of the goal so many times, they'd come close. And Manchester United weren't there. They weren't at the races at all. But once again, an example of, belief and hanging in, and just kind of, if you keep on working, sometimes good things happen. Didn't quite expect good things to happen quite as quickly as that, because I said, I think everybody watched that game saw it as Bayern Munich just, were, I wouldn't say strolling it, because they didn't score enough. They didn't build on that one goal lead, but they really looked troubled. And it looked very much at that stage as if Manchester United, with the fact that Roy Keane in particular was missing from that team after perhaps one of the great individual performances of all time in against Juventus in that second leg, where you knew he was, after he got booked, he was going to miss the final, but he was still very rarely seen such a singularly great performance where somebody dragged their team to win, but they sadly missed him. I think Scholes missed that final as well, if I'm not mistaken. So it was a bit of a makeshift Manchester United team, and you could very much understand the narrative that looked like it was getting written for that one. Understrength Manchester United just couldn't do it, missing Keane, missing Scholes, whatever. Run into Bayern Munich team that was solid, blah blah blah, and then the end comes and boom, completely turns it around.
We're getting towards the end of our time in today's episode, so I want to ask you a few wrap-up questions to have a little more fun before we part for today.
Okay.
So the first question I have for you is, who do you believe is the best African footballer of all time? Just based on individual talent. It doesn't have to be on a team that went to the World Cup or anything.
And then this is probably talked about with some ignorance, because we didn't see an awful lot when I was growing up. There was a period where Africa was producing a lot of very good individual players, but we didn't necessarily see them because we didn't have access to them. But I would, from my point of view, I'd say George Weah. I thought he was watching him his time with AC Milan in particular. He was a consummate centre forward.
I was gonna say, whenever I've had this discussion with friends, I always say him, even though Drogba's up there and Eusebio's up there, but George Weah, you can't really argue against it. Like what he did, coming from a country that he didn't get the opportunity to piggyback to a European superpower based on colonial relations and go play at the World Cup. Fair and square, played at Liberia and only played at 2 Africa Cup of Nations ever, and still went on to be the only African player to win World Player of the Year, which you can't really argue with, honestly.
Oh, incredible.
Who is the best English player and who is the best Scottish player of all time, in your opinion?
Best English player of all time. I would say Charlton. I would say Bobby Charlton. In terms of impact at club and international level, Jimmy Greaves just dying this week. Greaves was a phenomenal player. England had a lot, particularly in the 60s. Martin Peters was a player that I'm not trying to claim that he's the best English player ever, but they had a lot of players like Martin Peters that were just very, very good players. Bobby Moore was just a top class, world class player. Not quick at all, but brilliant at reading the game. Watching Bobby Moore, I thought, any young defender could learn a lot from him. But I would have to say Bobby Charlton. The great question, of course, is Duncan Edwards, who got killed in the Munich air disaster, and was a teammate of Charlton, might have gone on. Duncan Edwards could have been the guy to lift the World Cup in '66 if he'd survived the Munich air disaster. And I never saw him, but there's a generation you talk to who did see him. They said he was a phenomenal player and he would have gone on to be one of the best of all time. But in terms of what I've seen over the years, I would have to go for Bobby Charlton. In terms of Scotland, there's so many, but it's got to be Dennis Law. And then maybe maybe I'm a bit of a prisoner of my generation. I think when you're growing up, when you're in your teens, players that you saw at that time make a bigger impact than perhaps when you're a little bit older and you perhaps less getting carried away. But Dennis Law was just, you watch some old footage of Manchester United games, Law is 3 times quicker than any player on the park. He is an absolute whippet. He's as brave as they come. He's fantastic in the air. He's absolutely as sharp as attack. Only Scottish player to win the Ballon d'Or. I think did it in the 60s. Tremendous goal scorer. So I'd have to go for both Manchester United players, but Bobby Charlton and Dennis Law would probably be my picks.
What was the first game you ever remember watching on television? And what was your experience with that moment?
I remember vaguely. If you'd asked me the first ever game, I could tell you the first ever game I went to.
What was it?
We
can tack that one after.
First ever game that I remember on television was, and I'm going to say it was about in the 60s sometimes, because we didn't get a lot of televised soccer in these days. But I think it was Real Madrid against Rangers at Ibrox in the European Cup, and it was the early 60s. And I think Real Madrid absolutely gave Rangers a shit kicking. If that's what I remember. I was probably only about maybe 5 or 6 at the time. I remember the World Cup going on in Chile, but I never could say that I saw anything from that. But that's the first televised live game that I could remember. I can't even remember. I should be able to remember 62, which was Scotland England at Hampden, because that game was always televised every year, or every second year from Hampden. And Scotland won, but I can't. So I'd have to say that Rangers Real Madrid game from some yet to be determined year, but Rangers got tanked.
So then that leads to my next question, as we talked about just a bit before. What was the first game that you went to then?
It was, and I've never been able to prove that this game actually ever existed. So this might be, I don't think it was part of my imagination because I've talked to my dad and my dad can't remember it either. But I seem to remember that in 1961, it was Scotland amateurs or juniors. I think it was amateurs though versus Ireland amateurs. A game at Dens Park in Dundee, and I think Scotland won 4-1. That's what I remember. Whether it ever happened, I've Googled it, I've gone through books, I've done research. I cannot find anybody to confirm that game actually happened. But the reason I remember it was that turned out to be a test run. I'd never been to a game before. I was only 5 at the time, and my dad took me to that game, and that turned out to be a test run because the beginning of the 61-62 season, he started taking me to Dundee games, and I went to every home league game that year. I only missed one. I missed the Scottish Cup and they lost 1-0 at St Mirren. I had the mumps or the chicken pox or something stupid. And it finished up in the final game of the season, going to Perth, away trip. And Dundee had to, I think, at least draw that day to win the Scottish League. And they won 3-0. Alex Ferguson was playing for St Johnstone. And I'm one of the few people that can say they saw Alex Ferguson being relegated because that St Johnstone went down that day. And so that 61-62 was my first full season watching football. My team, Dundee, won the Scottish League for the first time in its existence. And I'm sorry to say, it's all been downhill from there. I say to my dad sometimes, why didn't you tell me that was the best it was ever going to be? I would have gone and played badminton or something instead. Because all I had is heartbreaks and said, well, that's not true. They had a great run. There's been some good times, and the great times that keep you coming back. But God, you do, if you support a team, you do learn to suffer, that's for sure.
Sometimes, like they say, you never know you're in the good old days until they're gone.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
The final question I have to ask you today is, what, from your perspective, was the best World Cup final that you've ever seen?
Best, like the final game or the
final
World
game.
Cup? It's
yeah, the
final
World Cup
game?
final game.
Oh, well, let me go through them individually. I can go through a few. Do you want me to? 66 is the first one I really remember. And that was a good final. Tension and all the rest and extra time. So you got to say that was a good one. 70 was good because Brazil were so brilliant. The Netherlands game wasn't a particularly great game in 74. 78, I thought was a good final. A lot of people disagree with me, but I thought that was a good final. 82, it wasn't a good Germany team. It was a good Italian team at the end. 86, that was a great final. 90 was a piece of crap.
The rematch just flopped.
Oh, that whole tournament. England celebrated Italia 1990. To me, there has been no worse World Cup than 1990. It was it was putrid as far as I am concerned. 94, that was a terrible World Cup. It was back-to-back bad World Cup finals. The only thing great about that was watching Baresi and Maldini play in particular. And Baresi kind of hobbling around like that was incredible performance from these two. But unfortunately, on this side of the Atlantic, the only remember is somebody missed penalty kicks, but that wasn't a great final. The 98, that was pretty good. 2002, not great. You go to 2006, certainly a drama on that one. It wasn't a bad final. And then we're getting to 2010. I didn't think I was particularly good, even though it went to extra time. No. And then you go 2014, not a great final either. I don't think Germany were just too good, even though it went to extra time. And 2018 was okay, but I don't think you can beat 1986. I think that was 2-0 up, 2-2, and Maradona in terms of from A to Z, from the beginning of the tournament to the end, an absolute monument. Without Maradona, Argentina were a less than average team. With Maradona, he was just, they won the tournament, and it was so much it was down to him. He had, a couple of players that supported him, but it was an incredible performance. And 2-0 up, 2-2, especially playing Germany, who, you always consider at their most dangerous when they're down. And you could see how that wasn't, that could swing Germany's way, and then to go up the other end and score that winner as well. For Argentina, scored the winner 3-2. I would have to say that's probably the final that I remember and enjoyed the most.
I think a goal that sums up his performance and the final in one shot is his goal that he ran deked everyone in the field. And I think that was against England, correct? Like
it was after the goal after the 100 goal.
Yeah, and that's, people will always compare Messi's goal versus Villarreal to that in 2009 versus Maradona's in 1986 versus England, and it's a pretty fair comparison because they're brilliant and super talented, even despite the opposite foots. But yeah, that was also, I must say as a side note, what an underrated era for Germany, because they made the World Cup final 3 times in a row, which no other team has ever done. 82, 86, 90. And even though they played Argentina in back-to-back and then in 2014, so that's a bit of a rivalry there. But yeah, 90 and 14 I didn't really like the finals, especially obviously I wasn't alive in 90, but looking back, like first final with red cards, 2 of them. And then Brema score, it was Brema.
Andres Brema. Yeah.
The penalty and then penalty. I don't know. It was weird. Like the whole tournament, like England celebrating like they won, even though they lost the semifinal. And then Italy also finishing not in the final. And then Argentina, like the whole Maradona thing. And it just seemed weird. But 86, like a lot of people talk about that as a really good one. And I mean, you said it best, like Germany going down 2-0, climbing back, and then scoring one late, I think 4 minutes to go from time. So that's a pretty good final to say is the best one. I don't know how many others, even before you watched, got better.
When you consider 1970, the heat in Mexico, and 1986, the heat in Mexico as well, and how much those talk about how the heat was going to spoil, and altitude in some cases going to spoil these World Cups, and never did. 70 was a great tournament, and so was 86. Like I thoroughly enjoyed both of them. So maybe fingers crossed with Mexico being partly part of a host in 2026, maybe we can look forward to that one as well. Or maybe Qatar's going to turn out as better than we thought as well. The bar, let's face it, the bar is pretty low for them. Anything short of disaster is going to be celebrated as a success, I think. So we'll see.
We will absolutely see. And with that, Bobby, I want to thank you for having been on today's episode. It was an immense pleasure being able to talk about football with you, especially reminiscing so many stories, old World Cups, amazing international players, and of course, being able to dabble a little bit into the Scottish realm and to really get to the nitty-gritty of who the best Scottish footballer is of all time. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the best Scottish and English players you say are also former Manchester United players. There's a bit of a direct relationship there with success in the club level and also internationally.
Yeah. Great. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for having me on.
And thank you everyone for listening to today's episode with retired football analyst, Bobby McMahon.